Om Ajnanatimidandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Dhena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. I feel very honored to be here in this jewel of a temple, and the temple here has been here for many, many years and has provided a sanctuary for many people to come find solace in a spiritual atmosphere. And I know I always do when I come here, feel spiritual atmosphere, because when traveling anywhere in this world, we can be affronted by many different kinds of energies that are enervating, take away our strength and so forth. In fact, the word travel comes from the word travail, which is a word that means extreme trouble, difficulty. And it actually, if you take it back a little further, it refers to an instrument of torture. Travail is a kind of a instrument with three like whips on the end of it. So moving about the world sometimes takes away our energy, but a traveler is happy when he or she finds home. And really, spiritual life is about finding home. And it's not that it's any physical location necessarily, but home is where the heart is and where we find complete solace. There's not a place that we can go anywhere in the world where we find complete solace necessarily, but because it's an internal process. Nonetheless, when there's a spiritual environment like this, there's every chance that by coming into it, I can center myself and find that happiness that's already within. And this is part of the process of Krishna consciousness. So whenever I come here, I feel like I'm in the place where I can find that home place in my heart. And all of you here are keeping the vibration going by coming here with sincere hearts and participating in all these spiritual programs. And this is a very traditional process called satsanga, when people who are like-minded, who are spiritually interested, come together. Then there's a kind of synergy that takes place. And our association is very important. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming here tonight to spend some time in a spiritual environment. And that's all you really have to do. It's not that you have to extend yourself in any extraordinary way, but if you put yourself in the right place. My spiritual master used to say that God helps those who help themselves, and helping oneself means putting yourself in a spiritual environment, especially where there's the sound vibration, spiritual sound vibration. If you can put yourself in front of that, then you can feel improvement. So before I begin speaking from the Bhagavad Gita, I'll mention a few verses from the Gita. How many of you are familiar with the Bhagavad Gita? Anybody here that doesn't know what it is? Okay, one person. Bhagavad Gita is a spiritual treatise, and it's a conversation that took place on a battlefield over 5,000 years ago. And it was a conversation between the great teacher, Krishna, who was acting at the time as a chariot driver. Just imagine like a taxi driver somewhere here, and then the person gets in and there's a conversation, and it turns into something that goes viral. Bhagavad Gita has definitely gone viral. It's translated into, even in English, over 500 times, what to speak of other languages all over the world. And there was a Hollywood movie about Bhagavad Gita, which was called The Legend of Bagger Vance, which had to do with, they changed the context where it was a golfer talking to his caddy. So the message of Bhagavad Gita is transmitted in a conversation. And before I comment on it, I offer my respects to my spiritual teacher, His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who is the founder of this organization. He came to America when he was 70 years old in 1965. And at that time, he didn't have any money or contacts, and nobody to pick him up at the station. In fact, there wasn't a station. He begged passage on a freighter ship. It wasn't even meant for passengers, but it's all he could get at that time. And he had received an order from his guru that he should try to spread the teachings of Bhagavad Gita in the West, because he was a good writer, and although English wasn't his first language, he had mastered it to the degree that he could write, and did write prolifically in English, and started to do it in India, and then he brought some of his books with him and came to the East Coast of America, and there started in a very simple, humble way, suffered the coldest winter that had been on record in New York City when he first arrived. And he's from Calcutta, which they've heard of snow perhaps, but they've never seen it. And after that, he started a regular routine, just sitting beneath a tree. That tree is still there. That's actually the longest standing member of this organization, that tree. It's in a park in New York City. And he would sit there every day, and he would repeat this mantra that you just heard when you came in. Many of you are familiar with it, but a mantra is a spiritual formula that is meant to elevate our consciousness, because the very word mantra, man means mind, and tra means to deliver. And it's an authorized mantra that's been passed down through the Vedic wisdom, especially in the Kali Santarana Upanishad. The Upanishads are ancient wisdom literatures about yoga, and especially about how to go beyond the mundane, go beyond the material world. And in it, it says, by repeating this mantra, the Hare Krishna mantra, I'll do it two words at a time. You can repeat Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. This in its entirety is called the Maha Mantra, and it says in the Kali Santarana Upanishad that this mantra will help to deliver one from all the complexities of life in this age of Kali that we live in now. It's a particular time period that gets a little bit complex. So he sat in the park and under a tree by himself, and he just sang the mantra. And he did so for a long time. Many, many months went by. Actually, when he first started, they asked him to move. That's how he ended up under the tree. So you can't do that here, you got to do it over there. So he took shelter of the tree, and he kept chanting. And then people started to take notice after some time. And a few people came, young people, and they listened to the mantra, and he would stop at intervals and explain what it was. And they listened, and then they began singing it also. And then some of them spontaneously got up and started dancing to the mantra. And then he, my spiritual master, opened a storefront with the help of some of the people who had come, and started giving open classes on the Bhagavad Gita. And he would speak the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, and then go out and do some chanting. And gradually, more and more people understood that this was a serious process of self-realization. And there were many sincere seekers at that time who came forward and were interested in finding out more. So from that small beginning, humble beginning, an international movement was born. He ended up starting a center there in New York, and then one subsequently opened in One of the members there came to California and opened a center, and then Montreal, and then New Mexico, and then some of the early members decided that if it was going to spread all over the world, which was basically the idea, to spread the vibration, because it's a spiritual vibration that's meant to help purify the heart and mind, then it would be a good idea if the Beatles got involved, because the Beatles were the most famous entity in the world at that time. And I mean, it might sound like a long shot that we'll just get on a plane and go meet the Beatles and introduce them to this. But that's what they suggested, a few of them, the young people. They said, we'll go and bring this to the Beatles, and then they can help us spread it around the world. So the founder said, yeah, go ahead and try. In fact, when they did go to the UK to do this, there was a requirement that you had to have at least some certain amount of cash with you, because they didn't want indigents just coming into the country and then depending on others. So the devotees at that time who went didn't have any money, but they borrowed some money, and each one of them would carry some money across the border, show it, and then they'd send it back to the next couple so they could come across. And when they got to the UK, they started a campaign to meet the Beatles, and there was a place where the Beatles would congregate to record their music and things at their center, which was Apple Records. So the devotees would send prasadam. They would cook something and then send it up to the Beatles, and they'd also send little gifts and things like that. And one thing led to another. It's a long story, and there have been several books written about this. For instance, there's a very senior devotee. He's one of the first devotees who joined this movement. His name Mukunda Swami. He lives in New Zealand or Australia. And he wrote a book recently all about this called Miracle on 2nd Avenue, because that's where it all started. And he tells this circuitous way in which they finally did meet the Beatles, headed by George Harrison, who then recorded a record in his studio with the Hare Krishna mantra on it, and that went viral. At that time, there were radio stations that would play these records, and when people heard it, the record with the Hare Krishna chant on it, they started calling in and said, "Can we hear it again? Can we hear it again?" And pretty soon the record became #1 in all of Europe, and people were asking that if these young people who were chanting this mantra could come and perform. So they started going all over Europe and singing the mantra at clubs and all kinds of places. So people thought it was, popular music. But then they would explain the theology behind it. Basically, we call sonic theology. And one thing led to another, one miraculous thing led to another, and then after just a little more than a decade, when he left the world in 1977 from Vrindavan, India, very holy place, and up to that time, tens of thousands of people had come into the fold of the Krishna consciousness movement and had begun practicing Krishna consciousness on every continent of the world. And he traveled around the world almost a dozen times and went to far-flung places. Every place he went, the movement flourished and sprung up and then flourished. And so this is a little history behind the founding of the Krishna consciousness movement. And therefore, before talking about the Bhagavad Gita, I always like to mention how it started and how this temple came into being. And also give respect to the person who painstakingly spread it around the world and who gave us the framework through which we could practice spiritual life. So, this book, Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavad means the one who has all opulences, who's all attractive. And Gita means song. As some people say it's called the Song of God or the Song of the Divine. And in the Gita itself, it's mentioned at the end, just by hearing this conversation, one can purify one's intelligence. And this is important because, as the Gita mentions, we live in basically a robotic, a biological robot. The body that we inhabit now, and this is, I'm using very particular language, that we are considered and defined as conscious living entities. Whereas the body is made up of matter. It's categorically different from our nature. We are eternal. Our nature is, we're called also the Atma. Everyone say Atma. So the Atma means the self. It's who we actually are. And the Atma is what animates the body. And it could be analogous to us driving a car. We drive a car, and at some point the car wears out, and we get into another car and drive the other car. The body is mechanical. It's called a yantra. Albeit it's biomechanical, and there's subtle and gross parts to the body. In fact, the analogy of a computer is something that's familiar to most of us. That is, there's hardware and software. So the physical part of the body, which is comprised of the water, there's a lot of water in this body, right? Like you can feel it right now. Take a moment to squish around, you'll see. I mean, it's just I kind of take it for granted that like this is me, but if you isolate, and this is part of the process of introspection in yoga, is to come to the point of saying, who am I actually? And the first resounding teaching in the Bhagavad Gita is what you're not. You're not the physical body. So it's made up of water and some earth, and you can feel the water. For instance, try in your arm. It's like it's a bag of water, right? There's about 80% water. If you drain off all the water, basically what you get is a little box full of what looks like, if you burn it, it looks like dirt. There's kind of just a small amount. So it's mostly water, and then you have some earth-like substance that makes up the other parts, the bones and things like that. So there, in the Gita, it's described the gross elements: earth, water, and then the fire element. You can feel you got a little heat. You're running at about 98.6 right now, right? This is this is the natural temperature. That's pretty hot. So there's fire, and earth, water, fire, and then air. Take a breath. Air runs throughout your body. All the cells breathe when you breathe in. And the air is coming in and out of the body. And now I'm getting to more subtle elements. And then there's ether, which is kind of like space. And then mind, which is also considered to be a material element, albeit it's ethereal and subtle. And then besides the mind, there's the intellect or the intelligence, which is an even finer substance. And above the intellect or the intelligence is the Atma. So there's a hierarchy described in the Bhagavad Gita that can be very helpful. So let's just think about it for a second. First of all, it says, lowest of all are the senses. And above the senses is the mind. Above the mind is the intellect, and above the intellect is the Atma. And the Atma, again, is the driver of the body. It's residing in a mechanical body, but it's non-mechanical. It's categorically different from the elements that I mentioned. And there's no time at which the combination of these lower material elements that I mentioned creates life. Life is a separate entity according to the teachings of the Vedas and of the Bhagavad Gita. And therefore, one of the preliminary processes in the practice of yoga and spiritual life is to distinguish between ourself and the body, to see the difference. And also to see that there's a hierarchy. There's the senses, and above the senses is the mind, above the mind is the intellect, and above the intellect there's the Atma. And in doing this, when Krishna describes this process of discretion, then he mentions that one should develop one's intelligence in such a way that it can help direct us towards living and working and organizing our lives in such a way that we can make spiritual advancement. So this requires what is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita is deliberate spiritual intelligence. Everyone please say deliberate spiritual intelligence. So this is one of the important foundational principles of spiritual life anywhere, is to develop this deliberate spiritual intelligence, which you can just call DSI. Call it DSI, say. DSI. Yeah, we could brand that, right? Write a book about a DSI. It sounds like a brand. So DSI means deliberate spiritual intelligence. And first thing is to have deliberate spiritual intelligence. It means to use your intellect to organize your life in such a way that you can benefit yourself spiritually. And to start that process, one has to deliberate. There's two words that are spelled the same, but they're pronounced differently, and they mean slightly different things. So say deliberate. Now say deliberate. It's spelled the same way. But before you can be deliberate, you have to deliberate. And deliberation means a few things. One is that you have to consider what are the consequences of my actions very carefully. This is actually a fundamentally important point, because if I don't consider the consequences of my actions in this world, in any realm, I may not be satisfied with the outcome. So it's good to get guidance to understand what the outcome of my actions are. There's a story about a man who was sitting on a tree, and he was on the inside of a branch, or he's on the branch, and he was sawing the branch. So you have the picture. He's sitting on a big branch, but he's sawing the branch. And then another man came by, and he looked up, and he thought, this doesn't look like a good scenario. So he informed the man that you better be careful, that you're sawing the inside of the branch. You're going to fall off if you keep sawing and it breaks through. That makes sense, right? So the man who was sawing said, leave me alone. Stop trying to interfere in my life. And a few minutes later, he fell from the tree. And then he got up and he thought, this man must be a great astrologer or something. So he ran after him and he said, how did you know I was going to fall from the tree? The man sawing the tree obviously hadn't considered the consequences of his action. He was blindly sawing and didn't see which end he was on, whereas the other person had a broader perspective. And so there's a lot of discussion in the Bhagavad Gita to give us some insight into how our actions have consequences. The decisions we make have consequences. And our life, one might argue, is a series of decisions that we have to make, one after the other. Do you all have to make decisions? Yes. But not very many, right? Every once in a while you have to make a decision? Every day? Multiple times a day? Say yes. Yeah, all day long we make decisions. And the way in which we make those decisions will have consequences. And when one develops DSI, deliberate spiritual intelligence, by taking advice from somebody who has a broader perspective, and we can avoid sawing the inside of a branch. Somebody said, don't do that. You're going to fall from the tree. It's like, leave me alone. I figure it out myself. But from deliberate spiritual intelligence, that there's a tacit understanding that there is information that's given to us with a higher perspective that can help us guide our decisions. So the consequences that we accrue in this world are what we had hoped they would be. And so we're not overcome by bad decisions. So this we find in the Bhagavad Gita in various places. Krishna describes how there are choices that we can make, and we should be careful when we make them, because there are, as he describes in the Bhagavad Gita, three modalities in this world by which things are affected. And if we make choices that are in the higher modes and the higher modalities, then the outcomes will be much better. For instance, in the realm of happiness, in a general way, Krishna describes how happiness in the mode of sattva, or what we call goodness, the modality of virtue, light, insight, clarity, wisdom, the outcome of that is very favorable. And the way he describes, for instance, happiness that comes from the mode of sattva, he says, in the beginning it seems like poison, but in the end it seems like nectar. So one may have to delay gratification, in other words, in order to get a result in a higher mode. And this takes some deliberation to come to this understanding that if I control my mind or senses now, and then later on I can get a better result. Whereas in the mode of passion, which is a lower mode, which is characterized by unlimited desires that come one after another, then Krishna says the happiness in this mode is that in the beginning it seems like nectar, and in the end it seems like poison. Does this register at all? The two descriptions, it sort of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Like, it really seemed like a good idea at the time, and it seemed like nectar at the beginning, and then in the end, it's like poison. Anyone? You don't have to raise your hand, but just... And then the mode of goodness, that it seemed like poison in the beginning, but because I controlled myself by deliberate spiritual intelligence, higher intelligence, I delayed gratification, and later on, I got a higher result. It seemed like nectar in the end. Poison in the beginning, but nectar in the end. So there are ways in which the Bhagavad Gita gives us a wider perspective so that we can deliberate and see the consequences of our actions. And the practice of spiritual life, I'll make one more point, and then I'm going to take some reflections before I move on to the next section. The practice of spiritual life is a process of purification, because there's a way in which my intelligence and my mind may become overburdened with various kinds of contamination. But let me put it in a less clinical terminology and something that maybe we can relate to. I gave the analogy of a computer earlier, right? Does anybody remember how that analogy worked in relationship to the body and mind and intelligence? Hardware and software. So which part's the hardware and which part's the software? Literally, like it's got, it's hard. So she's saying the body is hardware, and then the mind and intelligence is the software, and the Atma is the one who's running the computer, right? It's so, I'm sitting there and I'm punching the keys and so forth, and the software, is running the program, but it has to have a platform on which to run, which is the hardware. Does that sound accurate, computer engineers? That's not too far off. And it's everybody knows that, in the computer age. Everyone has a laptop, and it ever had it crash or you had to fix it or anything like that? Have you ever got anything on your computer in your software that you didn't want in there? Anything you sneak in? Say yes, you'll make me feel better. There are certain things I found out about called malware. That doesn't sound good at all, and it's not. And then there's adware. Things attach themselves to your computer, and they just keep coming back. And in fact, nowadays, we can relate to the technologies where, for instance, if you do a Google search, you ever do that? Yeah, you did. You do a Google search, and then what happens is that through the software that they've developed and the algorithms, tell me if I'm saying anything wrong, engineers out there. They start, whoever they is, somebody, is developing a composite of your personality by all the searches that you make. And your search, if you ask a question to Google, the answer you get and the selections you get is going to be different from somebody else's. Why? Because they're already anticipating what you've asked before, and therefore they're giving you a set of answers that's slightly different. It's custom made for you. And so there's that, and then there's also malware, and there's also adware. I don't know what other kinds of ware there are. Are there any other things between malware and adware that can gum up your software? Anyone? Engineers? Spyware. Yeah, thank you. Spyware, malware, adware. There may be other terminologies, but it's not good. It gets in there. And so in order, first of all, dealing with the different kinds of bugs that can get in your software, there's a way in which you have to clean them out regularly. Right? Otherwise, they just stay in there, and they can even get worse. They can degrade your system. They can take it over even, right? I'm not trying to freak anybody out here. Don't run home. But there are programs that you run. What are they called? That purge your computer of these various bugs. Antivirus. Yeah, antivirus. Has anybody ever run one of these? Did it help? It finds out, it identifies where all these malwares and adwares and spywares are, and then there's some system where it can go in through and purge them from your system. Yes? Okay. So in a similar way, when we're walking around the world, it's altogether likely, in fact, probable that we'll pick up all kinds of malware in our mind and intelligence. Where might we pick things up that go into our ear, into our eye, and then they stick in your brain? Have you ever had that happen? You get something in there that you didn't want? Anybody want to name anything? What? The radio. You heard sounds on the radio and got stuck in your head? And okay, so sounds from the radio. Anything else? Alarm clock going off in your head. Fact is, the senses are open to the greater environment, and lots of things come in, and they can stick inside your heart. Way I think about it sometimes, to use another analogy, when I was walking in my neighborhood in Burlingame, up near the San Francisco Bay, there are placards by all the storm drains there that say "No dumping drains to bay," and they have a little picture, an image of a fish, to remind everybody that whatever you dump in the gutter goes down those storm drains, it goes into the bay eventually. And the bay ends up having a lot of toxins in it. And so they're warning people, if you dump it here, it'll go in and it'll stay and contaminate the whole environment. So as I was walking, I was doing some of my mantra meditation, and I was thinking how these ears are like little storm drains. And whatever goes in here ends up in the bay of my heart. It stays in my consciousness. And so I was thinking of putting little placards up here saying no dumping. Because whatever I take in here, it'll end up. It'll stay in there. And just walking around in the environment of the world, especially nowadays, I may be exposed to many images and sounds and smells, all kinds of things that end up inside the software. And so to purify that, to run an antivirus system, there's a yoga process. And this is you have to run a powerful sound vibration through it that takes all that malware out and restores your software to its original condition. And that is the process of the repetition, the chanting of the mantra I mentioned at the beginning. And if you run that program regularly, then you'll keep your intelligence and your mind in a clear state so that there's not things popping up in it all the time. And in relationship to the various Google searches, the Bhagavad Gita mentions that there's a way in which this lifetime is only one frame. For instance, if you look at the way people used to make movies, there are thousands of little cellophane frames that run through the light. And this lifetime is just one tiny little frame in a continuum that I'm on, many different lifetimes. So let's say each lifetime See? I rest my case. In each lifetime, I'm making various inquiries, just like Google searches. And those make a composite so that there's a framework through which now in this lifetime I have a particular perspective that is custom made because of the way I've interacted with the world. And this is basically how the software of the mind works. We're getting all the time images that come into our through our senses. And the first thing is perception. The senses have to perceive things. In order really to perceive them, you have to be aware of them. And once you're aware of something and it goes into your system, then the next phase of the mind, this kind of software, is what is called interpretation. It interprets the kind of information that's coming in through the senses in various ways. And not everyone interprets the same incident in the same way because of the way the mind has become affected over many, many lifetimes, the state of the mind. So therefore, there's an old saying that we don't see the world the way it is, but we see the world the way we are. And so the condition of our mind and our intelligence will determine how we interpret what comes into us in the world. And that will very much determine the way that we make decisions. So purification of the mind and the intelligence through which one can develop this deliberate spiritual intelligence allows one to accurately interpret the world and therefore navigate it and make good decisions. And by doing that, one can have a happier and more progressive life and be in harmony with one's ultimate purpose, which is to be satisfied in oneself, in the Atma, and feel that satisfaction. So those are a few preliminary ideas and remarks that I wanted to make about DSI, deliberate spiritual intelligence. And before I move on to the next set of ideas, I just wanted to ask for your reflections. And a reflection isn't a question. A question has a question mark at the end, and I have to answer it. But what it is anything that you heard so far in the monologue that you found either interesting, stimulating, or useful. In that you might think that was one thought that I can take out of here with me. I'll put it in my pocket, and when you walk out the door and someone grabs you by the arm and says, what was that guy talking about in there? It's the one thing that you'll tell them, this was what it was about, the one thing I took out the door. So reflect back, if you would, the one thing that you heard, one concept, word, idea that you found useful. And we have, if I'm not incorrect, we have an extra microphone, right? That we can pass around? Or should I just repeat? Repeat, okay. Yes. Life is is comprised of a series of, or one aspect of our life is making a series of decisions, one after another, and it requires deliberate spiritual intelligence to make well-informed, good decisions. Thank you. What else? Yes?
No dumping.
Yes, so the ears are like the storm drains that I saw in the Bay Area that say no dumping drains to Bay. So you can keep a little, you can make a little placard. In fact, you might get a tattoo. That might be more practical. You get a little tattoo up here of that placard that's in Northern California. It says, no dumping drains to Bay. It has a little fish on it. You can take a picture to the tattoo parlor, and they'll put it up there and remind you, don't dump anything in here, because once you dump it in here, it inevitably ends up in the bay of your heart. And if you put toxins in here, then there will be a reaction, as we mentioned. Yes, what else? Yes. Yeah, you like that one? I really like that one. So what she's saying is, I had mentioned about the various modalities in the world, and that there are that happiness in the mode of you mentioned goodness. So in the beginning it's like poison, but at the end it's like nectar. And in the next lower mode, it seems like nectar in the beginning, but it's poison in the end. So this kind of information that comes from the Bhagavad Gita, when we deliberate on it, then we can be very deliberate in our decisions and say, oh, I recognize this. This is happiness in the mode of passion. So if I take it now, it seems like nectar, but in the end, the consequence, and remember, deliberation means to consider the consequences, one aspect of deliberation. What are the consequences to my actions? And this is very progressive, to have that right in your intelligence while you're considering things. Thank you. Very nice. What else? Yes.
It reminds me, there used to be this billboard that I would pass on my way to work every day. It was this red Prius. And I passed it enough times in the red color, it kind of caught my eye, and I passed it enough times that I almost was convinced that I needed a red Prius. And I don't like red cars, and I didn't need a new car.
Did you get a new car? After you saw that, you didn't need a new car. Yes, practicing DSI. Yeah. Yeah. And that's, this is a phenomenon that Krishna mentions in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. He describes how, as I'm observing the outer world, my senses may lock in on a particular thing, like a red Prius. And as I do that, then I'll develop a connection to it called a sangha. A sangha. It actually becomes a part of me. I project myself into it, and I think, that's for me. That is me. In fact, when you walk in to talk to the person about the Prius, you'll sit in there and, that's really you. I was like, that's really me? Yeah, that's you. Somebody might try on a hat and someone will say, yeah, that's really you. And this is the phenomena Krishna describes in the Gita. He says, Jyato Vishayam Pumsang Sangasteshu Pajayate. When you observe the world, you may look at a particular object and then start contemplating it, which has a particular meaning. It means you're thinking about it in such a way that you're considering there's something in it for me. And then gradually you become connected to it and attached to it. And then when you get your red Prius, it's part of you. You want me to prove it? If you bought your red Prius, how it becomes part of you? Say yes. Okay, so sangha, an anga, like say your arm. Your arm is an anga of your body. It's a part of it, right? Do you like your arm? Are you attached to it? Say yes. Thank you. Okay, so let's say we're sitting here and let's just say you did get your red Prius. And it's outside right here. And we hear somebody careening around the corner and there's some tires screeching and then it sounds like someone just sideswiped right where you parked your Prius. You triangulate from the sound and you said, I think that was my Prius. And so that's Karunya Shakti's Prius, and how does she feel now? She's sitting here, her Prius is there, and how does she feel? What? Bad. Well, define bad. Let's be more clinical about this. Heartbroken, okay. Well, would the physical heart change at all as she's sitting there? Yeah. Her pulse might go up, right? If your car was hit outside, at least that's what you thought. My car just got hit. Does your pulse go up? Anything else? What other physical symptoms? Yes. Crushed, but tell me physical symptoms. These are emotional, but which is good. Yeah, perspiration. That could happen, right? So let's just say, sweat starts to come from her brow, her heart rate goes up, she's feeling crushed, and she jumps up and runs to the door, and she looks outside, and it wasn't her Prius, it was Shooty's Prius. Now how does she feel? Good, right? She said good. And how does Shooty feel? Perspiration on the valve, and thinking like, what happened to my car? And there are literally tens of thousands of cars in Laguna Beach right now, and I guarantee you one of them's being hit right now. Somebody's scratching some car somewhere. But we don't care, because it's not our car, right? I mean, a car's a car. It's made of glass and metal and rubber and all that kind of stuff. But we only care when it's our car. I mean, there's a difference between cars and my car. So this concept Krishna presents in the Bhagavad Gita when he says, Jayato Vishayam Pumsan Sangasteshu Pujayate. You look out into the world and you consider certain things and you say, oh, that's mine. I want that. And you develop a connection with it. An actual, it's called Saanga. It becomes part of you. And now it's a problem for you because you have to carry it around wherever you go and deal with it on that level. So this is why the entity that we are, called the Atma, which we described before, it has a particular classification, which is, this is a little technical, but it's called Tatasta. Everyone say Tatasta. So Tatasta means that the Atma is open to suggestion. And whatever kind of suggestions it gets from its environment, it can go that way very easily. It can change it. We can change our mind at any time. We can decide that we like one thing and then completely reject it the next. Possible? Do people ever say they love each other and then a few months later they say they hate each other? Possible, right? There's all kinds of ways in which we're subjected to the information that comes into us from our environment, and because we're open to suggestion. So we're a little bit delicate in that sense. And this is one of the reasons that those who are practicing this yoga at a high level protect their environment a little bit. And they're a little bit careful about the kinds of things they expose themselves to, because in the category of deliberation, they consider the consequences of becoming attached to some things that may become a greater burden than they had hoped for. What other reflections do you have? One thing you heard that stuck in your mind. Yes. It works like antiviral software. Is that what you said? Yes, that's right. So we described about how the body is like hardware and the mind and intelligence is like software. And there's lots of ways in which we can get bugs like malware, adware, spyware can get in. And we have to run a program so that we can purify the mind. It's inevitable. Even if we organize our environment in a certain way, we still may become attacked or invaded by a particular kind of bug. So the way to stay in pure consciousness is to keep running this program, this purifying program, this chanting. Thank you. Yes?
I'm stuck on the tree.
Oh, the tree. You like the tree?
Just like the tree associated with Krishna, should that be venerated or someone to venerate the tree where Prabhupada was? They're not that.
Oh, that tree. Okay, because I mentioned two trees. And what is this a question?
No.
Or a reflection? Yeah.
Just like a tree associated with Krishna's pastimes, should that be venerated? Where one to venerate the tree associated with Prabhupada, they're not that far off.
Oh yeah, definitely. It is venerated. It's become a landmark there in New York. There's a placard there that announces that this tree was the place that the Hare Krishna movement was started. And people come and visit that tree from all over the world and pay their respects to it. He's the longest standing member of the Hare Krishna movement. Take 3 more reflections. Yes?
I like the other tree. The man is sitting on the branch of the sword. So when in doubt, we should be, like you said, we should be asking.
Okay, yes. So to recall, she's remembering that there's a man sitting on a branch and then sawing the inside of the branch. And then someone comes along and says, hey, you're going to fall if you keep doing that. And the man yells down at him and says, hey, leave me alone. And then a few minutes later, the branch cuts through, he falls to the ground, and then he runs after the man thinking he's a great astrologer. And what did you like about that?
So I like the point that when you mentioned after this analogy that we should be asking the seniors or the ones who have spiritual knowledge when in doubt.
Yes, if we can find information that we can trust, and this requires a little deliberation also, to find information that we find to be trustworthy, that is superior information. And we use that to guide us. This will help us to make proper decisions. And again, in the end of the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna mentions that one has to develop this deliberate spiritual intelligence by getting a superior kind of information. And so one of the suggestions is that the Bhagavad Gita itself is considered by spiritual practitioners over many thousands of years to be the very precise information that we need to develop that deliberate spiritual intelligence. So one of the very basic practices that anyone can take to develop this kind of fortified intelligence is to regularly read Bhagavad Gita. This morning, for instance, I took the time to read the 18th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. And it just took me about 15 minutes. I was waiting for something anyway, so I just took 15 minutes and I read it. And just within 15 minutes, one can develop the kind of insight and fortification that one needs in order to move in the world without becoming implicated, without entangling oneself more than necessary. And so this is one of the basic processes of Krishna consciousness, is simply to read the Bhagavad Gita. And it seems like a simple activity, and it doesn't take very long to do this, but it has a profound effect. In essence, it's one of the ways in which one can run this antiviral software clean out the mind and intelligence so that it's working properly. And I would suggest, in fact, I mean, this is just my suggestion, but I would suggest don't leave the house and face the world until you've run this through your intelligence. At least some of it. You might as well run the program before you walk out into the world, because you may be asked to make very important decisions, and unless you've fortified your intelligence and developed, what's it called? That's right. DSI, deliberate spiritual intelligence. Then you may make a decision that you regret later on because you haven't fortified your intelligence. So this could be helpful. I recommend keep a copy of the Bhagavad Gita close to you and get used to reading it regularly. There's 18 chapters in the Bhagavad Gita, and each one of them covers a area of knowledge that is very, very helpful for the way for us to move in the world in a way in which we can remain very positive and on an upward trajectory in life and avoid a lot of different kinds of problems that are created by making bad decisions. 2 more reflections. Yes? Can you repeat what he said? Can you hear it better than I did? You want to say it one more time? It's hard for you. The Atma? Yes. Yeah, say what he said.
So he said the Atma has infinite wisdom to control the mind and intelligence without to redesign the mind and intelligence without
Without what?
cleansing process by reading Bhagavad Gita. Right? Without doing a reading of Bhagavad Gita, without doing the codification every day. So the Atma has the infinite wisdom to redesign the mind and intelligence without doing the
Well, one of the ways that the Bhagavad Gita describes our situation is that we are already implicated. The mind intelligence is already contaminated, and we depend on the intelligence and the mind to assist us in various ways. And when the intelligence becomes corrupted, then it's very difficult for us to make proper spiritual decisions. So this is something that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu mentions, that it's important to take outside help. He taught one of his chief disciples, Sanatan Goswami, Maya Mukta Jivana Nahi Swata Krishna Gyan. He said it's not automatic that a person who's become overwhelmed by the condition of the material world can come out of it. It's not swata. It's not automatic that we just come out by ourselves. And he said, therefore, these books, specifically Bhagavad Gita, have been compiled by very enlightened spiritual beings. Like Srila Vyasadeva is considered to be the one who compiled, edited the Vedas, and presented them in such a way that we could take advantage of them. So he goes on to say that, therefore, one should take advantage of this. The Bhagavad Gita is a kind of intervening kind of software that helps one. And so the implication is that no, from our present position, we need some help that comes from a higher level. Once we get that, then the more we have deliberate spiritual intelligence, the more we can help ourselves. And the self can become more and more aware of itself and its existential position, and then make better and better choices. But in the beginning, especially, it's very important to take help from higher sources like the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you. Yes?
This is indirect reflection, but when we were talking about the car and being attached to these things, and it's been said before, and I thought you were going to say that, is that when you get in an accident,
Yeah.
That's how attached you are to it. And the other thing is the sign, the Prius sign. I come out my house every morning, and there's an insurance company around the corner. It's called Lord's Insurance.
Lord's Insurance.
And
Okay.
see that every day. So it's like the same thing. It's not like Prius, but I'm always thinking of Krishna when I see that sign every single day. Lord's Insurance.
Okay, well, it's a good point that you make, because this is one of the ways that one develops spiritual vision, is to see everything in the world in relationship with our original divine source, Krishna. In fact, everything comes from him, and everything's related to him, and for those who are spiritually advanced, they see the world in a very optimistic way. So they see whatever happens to me and whatever the confluence of circumstances are in my life, it's meant for my refinement and my betterment. And they also see various scenes and elements of the material world in relationship with Krishna. As an example, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is one of the primary wisdom literatures for teaching bhakti, there's a description of an enlightened being, a sage, who's living in the wilderness. And he meets a king named Yadu. The Yadu happens to be traveling with his retinue, and he meets this very enlightened being and has a conversation with him, and then asks, how did you become enlightened like this? And this great sage says, I have all my gurus here that are informing me and keeping my deliberate spiritual intelligence, and therefore I'm never lost. And the king looks around and says, where are all these gurus? You're out here in the wilderness by yourself. And then the sage says, oh, but I have 24. And he starts to name starts with natural elements, like he says, I see the mountain, and the mountain gets pounded by rain and lightning and so forth. But it continues to give to others. The streams come down, it gives minerals. It's very tolerant. So from the mountain I've learned tolerance. And similarly from the tree, I see that the tree gives shade to everybody. And even if somebody cuts it down, it continues to give. And then he saw one day, as he was sitting there practicing his spiritual meditation, that this small Karari hawk was flying high in the sky. And then two bigger hawks assailed it and grabbed it. And the Karari hawk had a piece of meat that he was going to take home and enjoy later. And these two other hawks grabbed him, and they said, give it up or die. And so he just gave it up. And in that instant, when he watched the smaller Karari hawk just hand it over, he thought, oh, okay, so in certain circumstances, just being detached, giving certain things up can be very helpful for me in life. I don't become as implicated. He took in that lesson. And in the various ways that he observes the world, he goes on and describes the 24 different gurus that he has. And they're seemingly ordinary entities. And it may come to you, when you have deliberate spiritual intelligence, it may come to you in the form of a billboard somewhere. And you'll say, oh yeah, that reminds me. That reminds me of my relationship and my purpose with the Supreme, and my relationship and my purpose in life, and so forth, just as you've brought up, as you're developing that. Right? Nice. So now we have Artik. It's 7:10 and it's time for Artik, right? So we've discussed a couple of basic ideas that hopefully are practical. And one of them is that I recommend that you repeat the Mahamantra, because it's a spiritual formula. It's a sound vibration that helps to purify the intelligence and the mind and the heart and all the body. And if you do that regularly, you'll find tangible purification of mind and heart. And what's the other thing that I recommend that's practical? Yes. Keep a Gita close to you. Yeah. Keep it really close to you. Like carry it around with you. Have it available to you at any time. And I can guarantee you this. If you take time every day, allocate some time, even if it's a few minutes, to read a part of the Gita. And if you read the same part over and over again, you'll start to get familiar with it. Or if you read various parts and you read through progressively, or if you just open anywhere and read, it will speak to you directly. And you'll find that the Bhagavad Gita is instilling within you this kind of deliberate spiritual intelligence that will help you to make better decisions, and your life will improve as a result of that. So this is something that anyone can try. You can just take a Bhagavad Gita with you, keep it close, and also don't leave the house before you've run the program through your system. Otherwise, you may pick up some really heavy kind of malware and regret it later on. So thank you very much, everybody. What we're going to do now is try a kind of very dynamic meditation where we get to dance. I'm writing a book called Never Miss a Chance to Dance. And there's there's a high probability that there's nobody else. It's a Sunday night. I don't know anybody else in Laguna Beach who's dancing right now. Everyone's relaxing or whatever. But we're going to get a chance to dance. So take an opportunity for it. And if you dance to the mantra and put your hands like this, try it once. Put your hands high in the air, and put this as a way of like letting go. And let's say if you put your hands like this and you were dancing and you had keys, cell phone, and all kinds of other stuff in your pocket, and you were dancing, it might all go flying out, right? And then you wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. You don't have to call anybody back, say, I lost my phone. So in the same way, when you put your arms in the air and you chant the spiritual mantra, then all your cares and troubles will go flying out of your heart. And they'll just fly away. And so this is a kind of meditation and practice of spiritual life. It's very natural just to dance and sing. So you can try this. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, dear devotees, for joining us for Bhagavad Gita class. We are finishing this episode and then we'll start another one for the Kirtan. Hare Krishna.
Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, hey, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman, Nachari Armarman.